welcome back. The show, the audio podcast, is called Matt Lewis Can't Lose, but you're the one who can't lose because we got Tom Nichols. You can't lose with Tom Nichols. He is a staff writer for The Atlantic, friend of the show. Welcome back, sir.
Hey, man. Thanks for having me, Matt.
Great to talk with you. So this is a little different. We're going to do hopefully something that's something of an evergreen conversation, talking about maybe big issues that have no timetable, or a look backward into things that deserve pondering and some insight. And I have to confess, I'm borrowing some of these questions from my friend Jamie Weinstein, who used to conclude his eponymous podcast by asking people these questions. So with no further ado, here we go. Of all the people who've changed and became Trumpy, so since say 2015, of the people you and I know, there's been a lot of people who have surprised us by becoming Trumpy. Who has surprised you the most?
In public life, you mean?
Yes. Or it could be a family member.
Because I got a pal and I got a few issues with him, and on Festivus, I'm going to tell him about it. I think the two that I always hammer on the hardest are J.D. Vance, who wrote in The Atlantic that Trump was cultural heroin, and, is now the thing. Now he is what he's become. I mean, that's a pretty hard over. That is a serious hard turn. And the other one that I always think of is centrist, moderate, middle of the road, establishment Republican Elise Stefanik, who is now talking about J6 hostages. But we could find all kinds of other examples in the kind of the right wing media sphere, but those two always jump out at me as
all you have to do is look at the National Review against Trump issue.
Right, go down that whole list. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, but some people disappointed us, but there were other people who surprised us in the other way, right? People that you might have very well thought would have gone over to the MAGA forces who didn't. Who's somebody that maybe has risen in your estimation since 2015?
The obvious and easy answer is Liz Cheney, right? I mean, Cheney had voted with Trump on a lot of stuff. She was known as one of the hardest right legislators. But Liz Cheney, to me, if people always ask us why did we become conservatives, it's because we always thought that we would be the people who would stand up in defense of the Constitution, right? We always had this kind of innate suspicion about our friends on the left that say, well, in the name of progress, because the Constitution's a living document and it's not sacred, and we can sort of, push it out of the way. But it turned out to be the right that did that. And I had always thought that becoming a conservative meant that you were the person that stood up and said, no, the Constitution actually matters. And that's what Cheney did. I also want to shout out to somebody like Russell Moore, the evangelical leader who got pretty badly sideways with his own church for coming out against Trump. And you wouldn't have thought so, right? You would have said, well, evangelicals have kind of sold out to Trump, but Dr. Moore didn't, and I always thought that was kind of admirable. So
there's some figures are maybe not quite as prominent today as they were a few years ago, but we're talking about people like Mike Flynn and Rudy Giuliani, who at one point were pretty highly regarded and respected in their respective fields. Do you believe that people like Flynn and Giuliani were always somewhat crazy and flawed, or do you think something changed, something happened to them that led them to turn out the way they did?
That's a really interesting question, because you've picked two guys where I think the answer for one is that he was always this way, and that's Flynn. And the other being Giuliani, who was always, and I don't, this is my at a distance kind of analysis. I've never known Giuliani, but that he seems typical of a lot of people who said, this is my chance. Trump is my chance to be back in the game, to be relevant. That unquenchable ambition, that need to be somebody that just takes you and just sucks your soul out. Now, there are people who claim that, Giuliani was always this bad. I discount that with the politician factor, right? He was always that bad. Nobody who becomes mayor of New York got there by being nice all the time. Flynn, I think, it was interesting because when I worked in the Defense Department and Flynn became head of the DIA, we were already hearing stuff about Flynn. It's like, hey, this new guy who's running DIA is kind of weird and has a lot of kooky ideas and totally kind of off the rails. I'd heard the expression about Flynn facts and that this threat, and I didn't know him. I mean, this was just, I'd heard that there was this 3-star down at the DIA who was just kind of nutty. And so, but again, I think there may have been a precipitating episode there, which is that he gets fired by Obama. That seems to break him. I don't know. I think there were a lot of people for whom Trump became that, I'm searching for a metaphor here, the stain you put on a slide that reveals, the malignancy, right? That the ultraviolet light that shows you where the contamination is. That there were just people who were waiting for somebody like Trump and couldn't resist that call.
So one of my favorite podcasts to listen to, I listen to a lot of podcasts. I think it's a great way to
listen to this one, man.
I know. Thank you. You're the one. No, I think it's a great way to get information and to learn things. And, if you're jogging or going for a walk, taking a shower or whatever, you can be learning, driving. I listen to podcasts all the time while I drive my kids to school. So I was listening maybe 6 months ago, you were on Jonah Goldberg's podcast, which was one of my favorites. And you guys had, I thought, a very good civil debate. But I noticed for several episodes thereafter, he kept referencing it. And I could never quite understand why, because he does these all the time, what it was about that debate and discussion that kind of stuck in his craw. Can you tell us? Do you have a sense for what might have transpired there that I didn't pick up on?
You're asking me to read Jonah's mind. As diplomats would say, we had a frank and candid exchange of views, and a friendly exchange of views between two guys who were basically on the same side about most things. But the part of it that I still remember thinking was kind of the real fastball that he threw was, "Why are you never Trumpers such a cheap date?" That was a great line. He's like, why is it that you feel the need to go along with Democrats on so many things? And I didn't think that was quite fair. And maybe, I'm hoping that I planted it, kind of put a pebble in his shoe about, listen, I don't want to sit here and argue with you about policy. This is not a policy election. This is not a policy issue. I know how to argue with liberals about tax rates. I know how to argue with liberals about defense budgets. I did that stuff when I was in the State House in Boston. I did some of that when I was working in the Senate. What I don't know how to do is restore the constitutional order after it's been destroyed. And I kept throwing it back to Jonah to say, yes, I agree with you. There are many things about Democrats that make me nuts. And, take that great line from Midnight Run when Jimmy Serrano says, he's a very self-righteous guy, these Democrats. It annoys me. Okay, I get it. There are things that, drive us nuts about this, but that's not the issue here. The issue is that we are facing an existential threat. And I think Jonah, I know that Jonah and others that have had arguments with this about keep backing up to, yes, but the Democrats will do terrible things. Why do you feel the need to agree with them? And I don't necessarily agree with them. I just don't feel like fighting with them while, I'll go for one more pop culture reference. The great Star Trek episode, Day of the Dove, where the Klingons and Kirk and his crew are all trapped on the Enterprise and they're made to fight over and over and over again by this alien entity. And finally, the Klingon says, we need no reason to hate humans. We need no instruction on how to hate humans. But for now, only a fool fights in a burning house. And so I always took the position, Klingon wisdom, only a fool fights in a burning house.
Was he? Do you think Jonah was saying basically like, why can't you and Bill Kristol like walk into the White House and negotiate some concessions? If you're going to support Biden, then let's work out a deal. But I'm not sure that to the degree you're supporting Biden, I'm not sure it's anything but a temporary marriage of convenience. And B, that's not really how parties change or evolve, right? Wouldn't, if you look at realignments, doesn't it kind of happen organically and subtly? So when he talks about the cheap date, what's he getting at?
Well, he just thinks that we've become so traumatized by Trump that we'll sell out and support Democrats on anything. And I don't want to mischaracterize what Jonah's saying, but that's what it came across like to me.
And there are some people who used to pretend, or maybe there are people who were considered conservatives who are now full scale, full on progressives on everything, and they don't just bite their tongue and go along with it, like they're leading the parade in a way.
But I have to point something out, and I pointed this out to Jonah. If I was that wrong about the Republican Party, not the party I joined, it annoys the crap out of me. People like, see, it shows you the Republicans were always fascist. That to me is just childlike and inane reasoning, because if you weren't there in 1980, then you don't know what you're talking about. But if I could be that wrong about the past 10 or 15 years, I started to have real heartburn about Gingrich and the Tea Party and all these guys. And I started to rethink not just partisan allegiance, but some of my political views. It's okay to change your political views. Bill, you mentioned Bill Kristol. Bill once tweeted something about that a lot of this was bringing out his inner socialist. I came out of a tradition as a young conservative in the 80s of reading Robert Nozick, right? Taxation is theft. Government should always have to, justify taking even one penny. I've mellowed on a lot of that stuff, in part because I am shocked at the way the Republicans have turned those ideas into nothing but instruments of cruelty, but also because I've been rethinking things over the course of my life. I changed my mind about the death penalty a long time ago. I was a Republican voting young conservative in the late 80s who was also a member of Amnesty. I quit Amnesty because I felt like they'd gone too far over the cliff for me. But, people are complicated. And I think in that sense, the questions that people like me or Bill or, I don't know, Max Boot or Charlie Sykes or you or anybody else gets is like, how can you have changed anything you think over the course of 40 years? Well, that is a normal human process, especially when there has been a traumatic event like the emergence of Donald Trump that makes you sit back and say, wait a minute, if I was wrong about this, what else was I wrong about?
Well said. Something you mentioned in passing that I want to linger on a little bit was Trumpism the inevitable conclusion of conservatism? Were we destined to get Trump? You and I have had this conversation before. Like, I think there are all of these alternate realities, right? That if Colin Powell runs in 96, if Mitt Romney wins in 2012, there are a lot
George Bush is reelected in 92.
There you go.
I think that Trump, the people who get mad at me when I say it's ridiculous to draw this kind of straight line from Goldwater through Nixon to Reagan to Trump, they say, well, of course, you're trying to defend, you're trying to compensate and rationalize a life of political views. Maybe that's true. I don't think it is. The political scientist in me sees a little more complexity there. And I think, to me, Trump has always been the perfect storm and prepped by years of being on television. Remember, Trump thinks about running in 99. Remember that? And he was going to run in 2000. One of my uncles was walking around wearing a Trump hat in 2000. And it was a complete, damn squib. It was a fizzle because the country hadn't been prepped yet for that level of lunacy. The other thing, though, and this is where Democrats get mad, think of how history could have been different if Democrats had said to themselves, look, the people of this country are just never going to elect Hillary Clinton. For whatever reason, fair or unfair, propaganda, dirty tricks, you name it. But as you're going into the 2010s, that to sit back and say she had her shot in 2007, it didn't happen. The American people, there's like a floor of her support and a ceiling for her support and a floor for her approval. It's just not going to happen. And I think history
there's so many variables.
Different.
I mean, what if Obama doesn't make fun of Trump at the White House Correspondents' Dinner? You know, what if?
Man, I said to my wife the other day, the most expensive joke in American history.
Well said. What if James Comey, or even better, what if Huma Abedin's husband Anthony Weiner doesn't do what he does with the laptop? I mean,
what if the Comey and Access Hollywood moments had been switched in time? What if the Comey letter had come way earlier, and the thing that happens a week before the election is Access Hollywood?
Yeah, and then if Trump loses, even if he loses narrowly, the narrative is, well, of course he was going to lose. The American people will never. Republicans had better learn their lesson. They better nominate Marco Rubio next time, or whatever.
Yeah, no, there was so much contingency. I mean, the people who have argued over the years to me of, well, this was the inevitable course of the Republican Party becoming more and more fascist. I'm like, the last nominee before Donald Trump was Mitt freaking Romney.
Yes.
Please, spare me this nonsense, that I'm sorry, George W. Bush, John McCain, Bob Dole, this is not exactly a parade of brown shirts. And I'll just throw a cheap shot out there, and anybody who's listening, this goes back to my complaint for years, that when you say that every Republican is a fascist and every Republican is a Nazi and every Republican is a right-wing kook, when somebody like Trump comes along, those criticisms no longer have any punch.
All right, I want to read you some names. Tell me if you've met the person and what you think of them. Let's start with Tucker Carlson.
Never met him. Think of him as a tragic and odious case of a needy guy who just kept amping up the crap that he was selling in order to stay on television.
Ben Shapiro.
Never met him. Don't think very much about him. Don't listen to his podcasts. Again, to me, these younger conservatives who have gone into the blogosphere and the kind of, famous for being famous space, are people that figured out that somehow being a personality with no real experience was a thing. So I always think of Shapiro in that space of, figured out in college that you could do this and make a job out of it, but I've never followed him. I think we've crossed swords now and then, here and there, back in the old days, but I just don't have a firm grip on him these days.
Hugh Hewitt.
Disgraceful. I mean, Hugh really is just, the stuff he writes is just so disingenuous that I can't read him anymore. I know he was, supposed to be the thinking man's conservative and asking the tough questions about law and nuclear weapons and all that stuff. But you were asking earlier about people who changed really fast. Hewitt probably could go into that bucket of, the people that have turned on a dime and become something.
I think Hugh views his role. And by the way, the other week, Rona Romney McDaniel was on Meet the Press. Very controversial. Just the fact that she had this NBC contributorship was controversial, but she basically implied that she could tell the truth now as a pundit. Yeah. But when she was head of the RNC, she couldn't, because when you're head of the RNC, you have to kind of take one for the team. I think she viewed her team as the Republican Party, right? You might view your team as Team America or Team Constitution. She viewed it as Team America. I think Hugh, who's been, nothing but good to me over the years, I've known him for a long time, but I think he sees the Republican Party and the standard bearer as like a client, and he's the attorney. And when you're an attorney and you go into court before the judge, you represent the client, whether they're guilty or not.
That's why I use the term disingenuous, because it's. I mean, I think he's one of the people where you just, and this is a phrase I use so often. He's one of the people where you want to look at him and say, you know better than this. You know better. You have a record that suggests that you know better than this. You're not Candace Owens or Charlie Kirk, or Ben Shapiro for that matter. You've been at this a long time. You know better than this. And I think it's just I find it inherently untrustworthy that to view the party as your client.
George Will.
I have met George Will. As you said, that Hugh's been very good to you. George has been very good to me over the years. He was, what can I say? When I was a young conservative, he was my role model in terms of his very prudent and consequential way of writing. I'm disturbed that lately he's had a couple of pieces where he's kind of down soft pedaling January 6th. Because he's the guy who I keep quoting who said January 6th should be burned into our minds the same way 9/11 is. So I'm surprised that he's been walking that back. But always somebody I admired, and always somebody who's writing kind of quality of writing I aspired to when I was a young conservative. I think like most of us, right? We all looked at Will and said, I want to learn to write that way. I never wore a bow tie though.
Yeah.
That was Carlson's chick.
Who is the historical figure you admire the most?
Well, I'm such a provincial New Englander that I've always had this very strong affinity for John Adams, simply because he was, as the musical says, he was obnoxious and disliked, but also had this
incredible
inner compass. It failed him now and then.
Yeah. But he was the first president to lose an election and leave. And so I think that makes him one of the most important, significant presidents in history, and underrated, I would say. We need to have there is no national monument to him in Washington, D.C. that I know of.
Not that I know of either.
There needs to be one.
I live in New England, so I'm kind of like, well, who cares if there's a monument there, But I think, we rightly praise Washington for walking away from what could have been practically a lifetime royal sinecure. And I'm actually going to write something about Washington later this year. But yeah, Adams had this, lodestar, this kind of strong intuitive understanding of the rule of law and right and wrong. And I also will just throw in one other thing for Adams, that when he said that our Constitution was made for a virtuous and religious people, that he understood this, that laws, he and Madison both understood that you can write down all the laws you want, but if we're not inherently a good people, none of that's going to save us.
And how much of that
and the fact that he was kind of an asshole, sort of, has always appealed to me.
But I want to go back to what you just said about this only works for a virtuous people. Last week when we talked, we were talking about how is it that despite the fact that Donald Trump has 2 impeachments, 4 indictments, 91 criminal counts, all this stuff, that he's effectively tied. How's that possible? Maybe Adams knew something, right?
I think this is, we talk about, we read the Federalist Papers and we talk about Trump as the guy Hamilton feared. But I think that the current situation in the country are the voters that Adams feared. That, and again, I have to keep throwing in Madison, because Madison's the guy who makes the argument that checks and balances can only save you up to a point. That once we're off the cliff, then you just can't keep writing laws and hoping that makes people good. And I think, Adams would say, well, this is what happens when we are a not a virtuous people when we become wrapped up in ourselves, when we decide that, you know, our own needs and wants and our own kind of laziness and decadence overtakes us. Remember, Adams is a guy not only loses the presidency, but then goes back to his farm and goes to work, you know, sitting up in Massachusetts. And I think I think that explains a lot about where we are, that we have kind of laughed off the notion of civic virtue and shame and stoicism and a lot of other things that all the founders understood to be important.
If America, you know, if this only works for a sort of a good, virtuous people, then how is it that the guy who paid off a porn star is on the verge of winning the presidency? And most people think the porn star thing actually isn't even a big deal. Like even people who are really against Donald Trump would put that as maybe the 10th most egregious thing he's done, right?
Yeah, we're not capable of thinking in those terms anymore.
Amazing.
I always think of poor Wilbur Mills. You know, let's pour one out for a moment for Wilbur Mills, who was the most powerful guy in Washington. For those of you that are not political junkies like me and Matt, right? I mean, Wilbur Mills was the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. Back in old Washington in the early 70s, that was you'd rather be chairman of Ways and Means than, like, you know, the Secretary of the Treasury or Vice President. That was real power. And he stumbles through the tidal basin, you know, pool, chasing a stripper named Fanny Fox that he'd been canoodling around with after a drunken night out, and it ends his career. He resigns. He walks away and says, it's kind of like, just, you know, I get it. I've been shamed. I have to leave public life. It's over. And I was a teenager when that happened. And now we have completely lost that because we've just been beaten down by it so much that we just can't even think in those terms.
What are 3 books that most shaped your worldview?
Yeah, that's the college entry exam, and yet I still have an answer to it that is absolutely true. 1984, which I read as a teenager, and it set me on the path towards studying the Soviet Union back in those days. The Screwtape Letters, which I read in college, which I'm a Christian, I'm a Greek Orthodox, but I fell in love both with the ideas and the language. That's when I started realizing what a beautiful writer C.S. Lewis was. And the third one, that's hard to say, because I want to add a piece of fiction that I think you know, was always important, but I didn't read a lot of fiction as a kid. So I'm going to say, and this is going to sound very preppy, even though I went to a working class high school, I'm going to say Richard III by Shakespeare, where I finally, you know, like, I really encountered this notion of just evil in politics and this kind of, you know, grand, you know, asshole-ish leader who was so awful. And again, I fell in love with the language. So those are the 3 things that after that, if I kept them, if you looked on my bookshelf, you had a collected works of Shakespeare, you had C.S. Lewis, and you had 1980. Are
there any columnists or writers that if you see their byline, you will always read their stuff?
You know, this is the easy get, right? Where I say, well, that Lewis guy, you know, he's pretty good.
C.S. Lewis, but okay.
Okay, well, I will put in a plug for my friend over at the Bulwark, Jonathan Last, who every time I read him, I feel like we've been doing the Vulcan mind meld, because he's as cranky and curmudgeonly as I am, and he's even capable of being darker and more depressing than I am. So I always read him. I'm a fan as well of Frank Bruni, David French. It would be unfair of me to start picking among my many beloved colleagues at The Atlantic. So I'll just say The Atlantic. But outside of my shop, you know, when I still read the Sunday paper, by the way, in paper. I don't know about you. I need
not anymore. My
No,
wife and
I get
we
the
used to go out to eat before we had kids, and we would get the Washington Post and the New York Times, and we would sit and have brunch on a Sunday after church.
mm,
And it was so much fun, but I don't read the paper, the hard copy
I
anymore.
still get 2 deliveries, and so, if I see those folks in my Sunday paper, I'll definitely go there, but, and, of course, Jonathan, I get through, electronically, but those are among the many. I mean, I think there's a lot of really good choices for people to read these days. I think that that's actually the downside of the internet age is that there are tons and tons of crap out there. I suppose there are people saying that I'm one of them, and maybe, but I feel like there's also just a lot of people really worth reading out there these days.
What is
When
an
we were,
what's an
I'm going to pursue that for 1 second and say, when you and I were kids, when you got the Washington Post, how many columnists were there in the world? Right? Like a dozen, maybe. 6 at one paper, 6 at another. Washington Post, you'd open the opinion section, same 5 guys, pretty much. You knew who they were, you read them. We now live in a time where you have your choice of,
Yeah.
dozens of really good writers in many venues. So,
Yeah.
3 cheers for the 21st century.
Amen, brother. I mean, trust me, I wouldn't have made it. The gatekeepers would not have allowed me into the world of writing opinion back then.
It's funny. People say to me, "Well, you've just done this because you're a writer, and I'm like, dude, I didn't go. I was a full-time federal employee until 2 years ago. Like, I didn't start doing this until I was in my 60s. So I think you're right.
You look like you're in your 30s. So, congrats.
Saying this is why we're friends, man.
What is an underrated public policy issue that deserves more attention?
Oh man. Okay. I don't know if it's underrated, but it's my hobby horse. Ban pharmaceutical ads from television. I think this is doing an immense amount of damage to the American psyche.
Yeah. It's like they're advertising sickness
and
right?
telling you to argue with doctors. I love the ones that say, if you're going to take this, tell your doctor about your medical history. Oh, is that your recommendation, genius? Like, you're going to walk in and doctors say, listen, I don't want to hear your medical history. I don't know who you are. Here's some very powerful psychoactive medication.
What I like is how the B-roll is always showing happy stuff while they're telling you the horrible potential side effects. Right. Bleeding from the eye could occur. People playing volleyball, drinking beer.
Do not taunt Happy Fun Ball. Remember that? Saturday Night Live? Do not taunt Happy Fun Ball.
Happy Fun Ball was dropped in separate bathtubs.
The worst one of all, and I don't see it much anymore, but there was an ad for a medication for schizophrenia, and the ad replicated what schizophrenics see through their eyes, of people staring at them and whispering about them, and I'm like, are you actually trying to sell medicine about schizophrenia by triggering people with paranoid schizophrenia who will watch this commercial? Wow. Is that what we've become in this country? So my underrated, I think it's bipartisan. You'd have to fight the pharmaceutical companies, but it would change. It would dramatically improve the quality of American life in a day if you could get all the pharmaceutical ads off television.
All right, I'll join your cause. John Adams statue, memorial, monument in Washington, D.C. Ban those ads. Last question for you. Tell us something about you that most people don't know.
Well, I'm such an oversharer on social media that most people know everything about me. Something about me that people don't know. That actually, for all of my joking about my bad taste in music, that I am actually very much as one of my friends said, a kind of melomaniac. That I listen to a lot of new age, kind of, people be surprised to find out that I sit and write and listen to Brian Eno, or Wyndham Hill, or from the 80s, or that kind of stuff. So I take huge amounts of punishment for my very bad musical tastes. But I think people would be really surprised to find out that most of my collection, especially when I'm working and the ambient music of my day is Steely Dan or James Taylor or 70s. I listen to a Soma FM station. It's an internet station called Left Coast 70s, which is all like mellow California rock from the 70s. So I think that would surprise people that, or maybe it wouldn't surprise people. Maybe they'd say this is just part of my horrendously bad taste in music. But I think the ambient and the electronica stuff would probably surprise you.
Very cool. All right, my friend. This was really fun. So happy we could do it. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
All right. And thank you for watching. Check out the audio podcast Matt Lewis Can't Lose, and we'll see you back here soon.